Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 1st, 2019, and today we're going to be looking through the Cook Political Report, inside elections, and also the Zapato Crystal Ball ratings for the 2020 presidential elections. So a new Democratic debate pretty much happened yesterday and the day before that. I will be covering that in tomorrow's video, but today I want to go through the 2020 election because I start every month, usually with a Bernie, Biden, Warren prediction. I did those a couple days ago, so I've decided to switch it up a little bit. I will be covering the debate information tomorrow, but as of today, I'm going to be covering just the 2020 election just because that's typically how I start off the month every single time. So this is the current, I believe actually, the website I'm using, by the way, is yet another political map simulator, so yapms.com. They have so many maps, so many helpful maps, but this is the Cook Political Report map, and I'm just going to be analyzing it pretty much, just going through it and just discussing what I personally agree with and what I disagree with. So obviously all the safe states I personally agree with at this point in time, but let's look around. So we have some toss-up states. We have Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. I completely understand that. Florida being close every election season, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin being the closest of them all, and Arizona, I believe, actually being one of the more closer Republican states that has shown a more Democratic identity in recent years. But this puts Trump at 220, and it puts all of Hillary Clinton's electoral votes back with the same states, winning Minnesota, winning Nevada, winning Colorado, winning Virginia. Democrats at 232, Donald Trump at 220. So Texas and Ohio are rated the same. They're pretty much equal in this as likely Republican states. But Iowa, Maine second, North Carolina and Georgia and and Nebraska second are all rated as lean. Now that takes me a little bit by surprise. I wouldn't necessarily say Ohio is necessarily more red than Iowa. Yes, I see the 2018 House election results, but that also could just be the unpopular, I guess, position that the president has taken on some issues, or the way that they're trying to send a message to the president to change before the 2020 election. But in Ohio, if we're looking, they just recently re-elected a Democratic senator. They had they had a pretty close governor election after having a pretty popular one. And it was just an overall interesting election season. I can understand as to why Iowa would be light red, but I wouldn't necessarily say Ohio is more Republican than Iowa. I would say they're both about lean Republican. North Carolina and Georgia, I completely agree with. Maine 2nd District, it really depends on the candidates, but as of right now, I think that most Democrats would actually lose in there. So I understand the lean red characterization. Completely understand it with Nebraska 2nd, and I completely understand the Texas call. I could see, in a way, with some candidates, how Texas may move over into the lean column. Don't necessarily see tilt or lean Democrat, but I think I pretty much agree with all of that. If we're looking at Minnesota and Nevada, though, I would say Minnesota is a little bit more to the left. New Hampshire and Nevada probably good, being light blue states. Colorado and Virginia, definitely understand why they're likely, and New Mexico I agree with as well. And those 5, I guess, toss-up characterizations, I wouldn't characterize most of them. Maybe light blue in some of the Rust Belt states, but Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, I generally agree with being, I guess, toss-up states. So let's go ahead and move over into the, I guess, inside elections map, which is probably one of the more detailed maps that I've seen, with some tilt characterizations, which most election, centers don't typically send out. They have lean, likely, and safe, but this one actually utilized tilt for the first time. But let's go ahead and just take a look. There are some areas where I completely disagree with, and I think it's probably just an error on their part in terms of uploading their results. Nebraska 2nd District is considered safe, safe Republican. Maine at large is considered lean Democrat, which I can understand if we're talking about a closer election, but Maine's 1st District should never be lean Democratic. They also have the Democrats at 269, inevitably making them the next president if everything stands up, which I wouldn't say is a good place to be at this point, because that definitely could be wrong. Let's say if Trump wins the election, putting them at 269 this early out is definitely not a good look for any of these polling companies, I guess, or just election centers. But Democrats at 269, Donald Trump at 215. Ohio and Georgia are characterized as likely Republican. Texas is characterized as safe Republican. I definitely don't agree with the Texas characterization. I definitely want to move it back down to likely. I don't think this is going to be anything over 10% for Trump, just because of the way the demographics are shifting. And if there is a stronger Democratic candidate, they could actually get it under 5%, but I think it's going to be generally around 5 to 7% for the Texas call. But Ohio and Georgia, I do not see Ohio and Georgia being likely unless there's a bad Democrat per se. I think that those states will be within the lean margin for the GOP, but I wouldn't necessarily necessarily say they're likely. And the fact that they're leaving out Iowa and keeping it as lean while keeping Ohio and Georgia as likely definitely puts a little bit of a different, I guess, spin on the map. Virginia and Colorado are both safe Democratic states. I'd bump them down one notch into the likely column, but still for the Democratic Party. I agree with the Minnesota characterization. I agree with Nevada and New Hampshire. Maine, I pointed that out before. I think Maine at large should actually be likely Democrat. Maine's first district would be safe, but I definitely could see how Trump could do better. I don't agree with the Maine second characterization. If anything, I would change that one to safe. Sorry, not safe, to toss-up. But there's currently 54 toss-up electoral votes from Florida, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. I definitely think that this map leans in favor of the Democratic Party. If we're looking at Michigan and Pennsylvania called already, both of those I do agree with the characterization as tilt Democratic states. I could say you could possibly see Pennsylvania's characterization lifted back to toss-up, but even then I would say that these are probably at most tilt to Democratic states. I wouldn't say they're in the GOP column, closer to toss-up and tilt to Democrat. Wisconsin, typically if those two states are going for the Democrats, Wisconsin would go as well, but I definitely could see a scenario in 2020 where it doesn't actually happen. Typically, that's what happens generally if we're talking about normal elections, but I don't think 2020 is going to be anything. I don't think it's going to be anything close to normal. Minnesota as a likely Democratic state. I mentioned that before. I agree with that one. New Mexico characterized as safe. I agree with that one. So Florida, North Carolina. I would actually characterize North Carolina as tilt or lean Republican before I would characterize Pennsylvania or Michigan, or even Arizona. I'd leave all three of those states as toss-ups. Florida, I completely agree with. Wisconsin, I agree with as a toss-up. And North Carolina, I guess you could say it's a toss-up, but I would say that it narrowly favors the GOP if we're just talking about the way that this state has voted in the past and the way that we're just looking at it now. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of these states are consistent amongst all the characterizations. I don't think any of these, firms believe that Utah is going to be a toss-up again, believe that Indiana, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, 2008 toss-ups could come back to being toss-ups. Kansas, some people even talked about Kansas going for people like Bernie Sanders. I don't necessarily see that happening. But if we're just looking at the overall map, pretty much what's consistent through all of these is that they start Donald Trump with the same amount of electoral votes that I start him off with the safe characterizations, in this case minus Texas and Nebraska second. But generally that's how I start off every election video, with Donald Trump at a set amount of electoral votes. It makes sense. If we're just looking at the general electoral map, this electoral map does not change it does change per election, yes. It does not change drastically. If we're looking at the overall center of America, it's typically Republican. If we're looking at the Northeast and the West, it's typically Democratic. But let's go ahead and just move on to the next map. Maybe there's something different. We're looking at Sabato's crystal ball. And on here, we do have some different characterizations. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting map. We have Donald Trump actually ahead of the Democrats at 248, which is the highest number that we've seen for him amongst all of these firms, and the Democrats at 244, even further than what they were with Hillary Clinton. But if we're looking, let's talk about where these numbers are. So again, middle of America, agree with that. Southern part of America, I agree with too. West Coast, Northeast, I agree with. Maine second, I would say maybe tilt lean could fit it. If we're looking at a number of these Democrats, it's probably going to end up that way anyway. Maine's first district, completely agree with. Could be likely, but it's probably going to be safe. Maine at large, I agree with. Again, it could move over to likely, but that's a lot of leeway. Still agree with who's the projected winner overall. But interesting, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona are the only toss-ups here. We have Michigan, a flip from the GOP. We have Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Iowa, Texas, all filled in for the Republican Party. But Nebraska's second is left up for grabs. Arizona is left up for grabs. If we're looking, that's pretty weird. Iowa and Ohio, I understand them having the same characterization, and that's how I typically have both of those states. North Carolina, I agree. Georgia, I agree. Texas, I would possibly move it over into the likely column, but again, I agree with where the expected winner is going to go. I would move Florida down to the tilt Republican column. I wouldn't be too confident in saying that it's lean while leaving Nebraska's second as a pure toss-up. I definitely think that Nebraska's second is going to be more in favor of the GOP than Florida will be. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I would expect to have at least some characterizations if they're bold enough to put Michigan and Minnesota on the same level as lean Democratic states. Again, Nevada, I agree with. Virginia and Colorado, I would move over to likely, and New Mexico to safe. But I generally agree with the Arizona characterization as toss-up state. I would keep all three of the Rust Belt states as toss-up, or maybe Michigan and Pennsylvania, but I wouldn't really leave Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then characterize Michigan further than tilt, but as a lean Democratic state. Minnesota and Michigan are definitely not on the same scale in the 2020 election. I personally do not believe that. If you're looking at Maine's second district, again, I agree with that one. with most of these Democrats at least. But yeah, so this map doesn't throw me off too much. I just think that the ratings could be different. I agree with the general winners of each individual state, just that the ratings may be a little bit too lenient on the president. I think that they definitely aren't showing the true effect about Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia being pretty solid Democratic states. I don't think they overestimate the president in some areas because they're showing Michigan as a Democratic state and Minnesota as a Democratic state pretty much as equals. But I think that in some areas they're underestimating the Democratic Party's enthusiasm and, I guess, historical voting patterns. But yeah, so that pretty much wraps up my analyzation of all three of the firms and their, I guess, overall ideas for the 2020 election as of right now. Again, it is August of 2019. Things can definitely change, but this is from Cook, Inside Elections, and Sabato's Crystal Ball. And yeah, so thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.